Good morning and welcome to Hay Festival Digital, and thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Andy Friars and I am the Sustainability Director for Hay Festival, and I'm responsible for the Trans.MISSION II project, which we are running in partnership with the Natural Environment Research Council. They are the UK's largest funder of independent environmental science research, training and innovation, and delivered through universities and research centres. Trans.MISSION brings together artists and scientists to find new ways of communicating environmental science to new audiences. We started the project originally 3 or 4 years ago now, and did the first project Trans.MISSION, which focused purely on the UK. But the success of that meant that we wanted to look a bit further afield at where we work as Hay Festival around the world, but also where NERC funds science research as well. For Trans.MISSION II, we went to 3 countries here in the UK, Peru and Colombia. We've looked at Peru and Colombia over the last 2 days, but today we are focusing on the UK. And I'm delighted to welcome here today the people who've been involved in the UK arm of the project. Dr Sarah Ayling is a plant physiologist based at the Department of Geography and Environmental Management at the University West of England, Bristol. She has studied the effects of drought and the root environment on plant growth in the UK, USA and Australia, and she is experienced in nutrient transport, ion imaging and water relations. We also have Lindsey McEwen, who is Professor of Environmental Management, also at the University of West of England, Bristol. As a geographer, she is also the Director of the Centre for Water Communities and Resilience. Over the last 30 years, her research has included flood histories, water risk management, water science communication, and community-based research and learning. And we're also joined by the author, Patrice Lawrence. She is a writer and journalist, and has published fiction for both adults and children. Her writing has won awards, including the Waterstones Children's Book Prize for older children, the Bookseller YA Book Prize, and she was also shortlisted for the Costa Children's Award. Thank you so much for the 3 of you for joining us this morning. I'd like to kick off, please, with you, Lindsey, as the head of the DRY project, which is the project which the story was based within. As you were head of the DRY project, can you explain a bit about the research? What is the scientific research which is going on within the DRY project?
Well, the DRY project is Drought, Risk and You. It's been running for 4 years. It recognised that drought in the UK is a diffuse and hidden risk, very different from flooding, which is very visual and high profile in the media. Tends to be othered. It tends to be thought about as being in an international context rather than being in the UK. And the impacts are very wide ranging. They're multi-stakeholder. They impact on business, agriculture, public and communities. And if we look at climate change scenarios, they tell us that drought's going to become more frequent. So we're going to have warmer, drier summers and warmer, wetter winters. And historically within drought risk research, there's been a heavy focus on specialist science, which is good and important. But the DRY project tried to bring stories alongside science as an evidence base to support better decision making. So the DRY project was an interdisciplinary project. It is an interdisciplinary project. It involves ecologists, plant physiologists, agronomists, drought risk modelers, working with those people who are specialists in different forms of narrative work and storytelling. And that's part of the distinctive feature, that interdisciplinary nature. So what we've been trying to do is to daylight drought, to find ways of making it visible, whether that be graphically or through stories or through other means. So within the DRY project, what we've been doing is undertaking a series of creative experiments, really, about bringing science and storing into the same space. And we've been doing that working with a range of stakeholders in 7 catchments across the UK, in Scotland, England and Wales. And one of the challenges of this is that drought risk and experience of past drought, many people have to go back to 1975, 76, which is outside the living memories of many people, much of the population in the UK. And those memories of drought in 1976 are not necessarily negative stories. They are, for many, the halcyon days of youth with ABBA and heat waves and so on. And so there's one of the challenges in terms of dealing with drought risk, is about memory and about how you might bring science and memory into the same space. However, if you take a book like The Great Drought by Evelyn Cox, you get a very different story of the 1975-6 drought, that of a Shropshire farmer, a dairy farmer, trying to manage livestock over that period. So there are other stories that we can actually try and connect with the science. Another challenge within the UK in terms of trying to bring science and storying together is that there's a series of myths that are pervasive. So Britain is a green and lush and wet land. And one of the things that's distinctive about it is about grassland. And it's very much part of the British psyche. So it was a pleasure within the Dry project to bring and to work with Sarah Ayling and Jill Thompson from the Centre of Ecology and Hydrology up in Edinburgh to look at the impacts of grassland drought and to actually engage stakeholders and citizen scientists in that process.
Well, you've very nicely led up to bringing in Sarah there, Lindsey. Thank you for that sort of overview of the Dry project. Sarah, can you, as the sort of the lead on the grassland part of this project, just talk a bit about, because it's the grassland project where the story was mostly focused on, as it was a science which influenced the story mostly. Can you talk, Sarah, about the grassland project and give the audience a bit more detail about the science behind what the scientific research has been going on?
Yeah, yes, of course. Thank you. So I should first say that the person who was actually had overall responsibility for the fieldwork was Dr. Jill Thompson, who's based in Edinburgh, and then I assisted her. And if you'd like to show the slides, I can show some of the grasslands that we worked on and talk a little bit about the experience. So this is probably what springs to most people's mind as a typical British meadow. This is actually one of the field sites we worked on in South Gloucestershire. As you can see, there's a wide range of different plant species growing there. Lots of flowers, buttercups, clover. These are two of the other grasslands we worked at. The one on the left-hand side of the screen is in Yorkshire in the Peak District, quite close to Barnsley and Sheffield. The one on the right-hand side is in Fife, a place called Craigmeads Meadow, where there's a lot of moss and heather, but both sites are very species rich. These aren't grazed as intensively as the lush meadows that we saw from South Gloucestershire, but they're still a very important type of grassland species, grassland habitat. Lindsey said at the beginning that we worked in 7 catchments, but for the grassland experiment, we just focused on 3. The catchment of the River Frome, which is close to Bristol, of the River Don, which is near Sheffield, and the River Eden, which is in Fife. And these catchments are a similar size and gave us a sort of north to south and west to east, gradient across the country, so we could compare the effects of drought in different regions within the country. And I think we'll go on to the next slide. So the first stage of the experiment, once we'd selected our sites, was putting up these frames. They're 3 meters by 3 meters, because the type of experiment we were doing is called a mesocosm experiment, which means we have a medium-sized area. So we've got some control over what's happening. We couldn't work on a whole field scale. We couldn't control the environment of a whole field, but it's closer to the real world than working in a lab. To make our drought conditions, we put on these roofs, which allowed light through, and we blocked out about 50% of the rainfall. And then we had plastic pipes that carried away the rain. And we had instruments attached to the frames so we could measure rainfall, temperature, humidity, wind speed, the amount of light getting through the roofs onto the plants, because we wanted to really know what the effect of the frames were in case the frames upset the plants. And then obviously, although the sites we worked at would normally be grazed, we didn't really want animals grazing, so at some of the sites we had to fence them off, because for some reason animals love chewing wires. They seem to, they're attracted to them, even when there's plenty of other grass that they might want to eat. So this is our site in Fife. And a very important part of the experiment was working with volunteers. So here you can see some volunteers helping us in the field that was near the University of the West of England, and they're measuring the height of certain plant species that we picked out. And so one of the things that we could give to the volunteers was teaching them about plant identification, while they helped us with collecting the data. And volunteers also helped us in the lab. So in the autumn, or at the time when the farmer would take hay from the field, we took samples of vegetation, took them back to the lab, sorted them into the different types of plants, the grasses, the what we call broadleaf plants, so thistles, buttercups, clovers, separated out the moss. That's what you can see in this envelope. It's quite painstaking work, but well, I was surprised how popular it was. And then we dried those samples. Another thing we did with the volunteers was we counted the number of flowers within our plots, and then over a 5-minute time we observed the number of insects that landed. This is a visit by members of a local group to one of our sites in Sheffield. The gentleman in bright oranges from the Environment Agency, and the lady in the bright blue is from the University of Sheffield. So they wanted to know what the experiment was, what we were finding, how it fitted into, you know, their plans for the local area. This site actually is one within the fertiliser minimisation area that Yorkshire Water have set up around their reservoirs. So it was quite interesting to look at that grassland. And if you have any doubt about why grass might be important, in the UK, 40% of the land is agricultural grasslands. So that's 15 million hectares. And actually, worldwide, more than 40% of the land area is covered with grasslands. So that's a bit of the scientific background to the project.
That's great, Sarah. Thank you so much for covering that. Can you just sort of, in terms of the results that you've found, have you found that certain species are more drought resistant? Is it what are the sort of range of factors that determine drought resistance for the areas?
Well, we're still in the preliminary stages of the analysis at the moment, but at the moment it seems that in these type of grasslands that we looked at, where there's a very wide range of species, the yields actually stand up quite well, even when you've reduced the rainfall by 50%. So, because if you have a large number of species, there's always going to be some species that do well each year, and some will do less well. We did identify the range of species that were present in each of the fields, and we haven't, over the course of the experiment, which was 3 years, been able to find any changes in species, what we call species composition, so the number of the types of species that were present, which right. You know, it is good news if you're a farmer who's farming permanent grasslands.
Okay, that's excellent. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Lindsey, for sort of taking us through the science. I'd like to bring in Patrice now, who, as a writer and journalist, Patrice, why would you want to get involved in a project like Transmission, looking at grasslands? I mean, is this something you've always loved, grass, or is it a new area for you?
I mean, I grew up in West Sussex, so when I was little, there were sort of fields behind the house and woods we used to play in, and I also remember the sort of '76 drought. And I think as a child, it was a different experience from adults. So, you know, I can remember just having lots of ice cream and ladybirds, and I think I wanted to get involved because it's actually not anything I've been asked to do before, and which for me is fantastic. I like challenges, and I also I'm quite nosy, so if it's something that I don't know about, I'm really interested to know more. So it was very much a challenge, but also it made me think about all the questions that I should have been asking for quite a long time.
So, Patrice, in terms of what sort of process did you go through? I mean, as a sort of journalist and writer, then clearly you are used to sort of finding out and know, as you said, you're nosy, finding out stories. But how did the process work of working with the scientists?
I think the issue was sort of trying to marry the sort of two parts of it, of the sort of my passions as a writer for young adults and the science. So I met Sarah and Lindsey and went up to Edinburgh to meet Jill, and I was kind of quite interested firstly in what are the messages that they have, what is it that they sort of wanted me to say. And then I sort of went back a step and thought about actually what is my strength as a writer, what am I passionate about? And I'm passionate about young people's voices, and particularly the young people who don't get heard. And I think it was actually probably a throwaway comment either by Lindsey or Sarah about the fact that potatoes got really expensive in the 1976 drought, because actually it was the land was either quite often too dry to grow them. So the farmers who actually could grow potatoes got really rich. And that, I mean, come on, chips, that lodged with me. And then also, then I met when talking to Jill as well, and she talks about the fact about, if we set it in the future, what could be taboo? If we're thinking about water shortages, what if it is taboo to, because when I grew up, people, for instance, didn't always wear seatbelts in the car, and people used to drink and drive, and gradually that's got more sort of taboo. So what if it would be taboo like that to wash your hair every day? So I started to think about the everyday changes that could be made, and then I gave those sort of ideas to a character. What if you're going on your sort of date with a sort of boy you really like, and you're getting ready, and all these changes that have happened because of water shortages are your everyday normal? So I kind of took it from there.
Does setting in the future give you some freedom to play around with the sort of an imagined future? I know when we were talking to Juan Cardenas yesterday from Colombia, he set his in the future as well, precisely for the same reason. It allows you to sort of to play with an imagination, to imagine what it might be like in order to maybe not be there in the future.
Yeah, true, and I think setting it sort of 50 years, it'd be within a lot of young people's lifetime, certainly hopefully with my daughter's lifetime. So you can have a world that is very, very similar, but there's just those small gradual changes that you don't notice. So I suppose another analogy is the smoking ban that came in all of our lifetimes. How many of us grew up when people could smoke on buses, in cinemas, on planes, restaurants, and how now that is again in England. Like, really? So gradually those things that we adapt to, I think you can sort of just project that forward 50 years. What have we so adapted to that we don't think about it? So yes, it gives you room to play with those notions and to think about, is that what we want? And also for me, I think there's a bit about putting in humour and putting in things that are also really relatable as well to most young people.
And was it important that, because you've written the story from a perspective of a young person, is this important for you looking at that generation? I mean, why did you aim it particularly at that area?
I think I've sort of thought about, I write quite a lot for young adults, and I'm actually really passionate about how young adults and teenagers are, about their voices and how some of their voices get sort of shoved sideways. And I think many young people are funny and sort of tolerant and thoughtful, and many want to change the world even if they don't know it yet. So yes, I thought if you have a voice of a young person, and which would almost looking back from the future to young people now, I thought that could sort of work in terms of discussion points as well.
Sarah and Lindsey, in terms of your working processes, I mean, how did you find for working with the artists? You also, the Dry project itself, as you said, is dealing with stories and myths. But how did you work with Patrice, and did you find areas of commonality, or did you find areas where the scientific process was more rigorous and you were like going, where's this story going? Lindsey, do you want to comment first?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the science work that we were doing, we were looking past in terms of trying to gather people's memories, but we'd also been looking future. A lot of the work that was done with the drought risk modelers was looking at future scenarios to the 2020s, 2050s, 2080s. And so that sort of future perspective and engaging stakeholders around different possible projections of the future was very much part of the meat and drink of the Dry project. So in a sense that that this future facing story naturally fitted in with what we were trying to do anyway. The other thing that we found that was challenging within the Dry project was engaging younger groups who tend to be a bit risk averse and perhaps less likely perhaps to take action. And so the opportunity to work with a creative practitioner to engage that group, particularly around issues around change, around changing social norms, about things that we might expect in society, like, for example, how often you wash your hair, how you use water, was a great opportunity for us, because it's about starting conversations with different groups and about bringing the science and the storying together in a different way in this context. So yeah, we very much welcomed the opportunity to work in a more emergent way with Patrice.
That's great. So I mean, we have got we're going to go to a short clip of the story. The full story is too long to play in this event, so it is available on our YouTube channel or through our website, Hay Festival website. Please do go and watch it after the event. But we're going to show a short clip. But before we do that, originally we were going to have this filmed with a young person through our Hay Academy, but due to the pandemic, we couldn't do that. So instead, Patrice very generously volunteered her daughter to read this. I'm not sure how much to say she had in it, but she does a very, very good job. So we're going to go to a short clip from the story with Patrice's daughter being the character. Can we show the clip, please?
You know what else is happening today. You can't have missed it. They've been throwing the adverts at us for months. You must have seen the plane they had flying over with the banner last week. Today is the first day zero. All our taps are turned off from 10 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon. Of course there's exemptions, pregnant women, old people, little kids and so on. But my mother is so fierce about this, she'd glue our taps shut herself, even if we did have a bedroom full of screaming newborn babies and a 90-year-old uncle gasping in the corner. So nothing's flowing. We've got enough water put aside for drinking and cooking, but no one's having a long, lazy shower this afternoon. Who cares if they have their first proper date with Cruz?
So that's a very, very short clip. The story is clearly about a young person going on their first date. And you can find out what day zero is by watching the full story. We won't give away any more on that. before we go to questions from the audience, there is a fourth element to the Transmission II project, as well as the 3 stories with artists, authors working with scientists in Peru, Colombia, and in the UK. We also commissioned an animator, Chris Horton, to look at all the science across the 3 countries and to produce an animation to try and encompass all that work in a very short time. Chris Horton is an expert at this. He's an illustrator and author. He's written and illustrated 5 books and also works on design with businesses. He was listed in the Times magazine as in the Design 100 for the work he's been doing with fair trade clothing company People Tree, and he works with a number of other businesses on design. We've worked with him before on the first Transmission project. Chris Horton, welcome to joining us.
Hi, Andy. Thanks very much.
So the fourth part of this is animation, and you work with the scientists we've been just talking with now, and with Patrice. You worked with the Colombians and also with the Peruvians. How did that process go about of making the animation? How did you actually pull that information together?
Yeah, it was quite challenging, actually. There was a lot of emails. There's a lot of people involved. But yeah, I got through the what was made by each of the 3 projects, and then, you know, some are set in the future, obviously. So it was difficult to, you know, I was going to sum up what the thing was about. So in each case, I contacted the scientists as well, and sort of said, like, can you tell me the background to this, and you know, so that could inform what the film could be as well. So each one, we really just had less than a minute to sort of tell the story. So it's a really concise sort of summary of the project. But yeah, so that you know, Colombia was quite straightforward because it was just telling the story of how the glacier melted and how the pollutants sorry, Peru, all the pollutants came down the river. Colombia was a bit more tricky because it's yeah, there was a lot more elements involved, and yeah, so it was quite challenging.
There's a lot more social political stuff as well, wasn't, as well as the pure science. There was also the interactions with the communities and things within Colombia, I think, which did make it more difficult. And then the UK, obviously, when we see the animation, which we'll show shortly, chips was the was your linking point.
Yeah, no. So in each project, I tried to sort of sum up the tone that, I mean, Patrice was talking about this whole thing of, you know, you go on a simple date and you share chips with your date, and, you know, that might not be possible. So it's sort of a joke, but it's the, you know, it's fascinating the how you know, climate, that, you know, in the 70s, that this actually impacted on the entire UK diet. And you know, for me, we have a very short amount of time. I'm just trying to make people interested, you know, in this 1 minute, to sort of just show people, oh, this is what people, these scientists are working on. This has impacted our lives in the past, and you know, what can happen in the future, and these are very interesting stories.
That's great, Chris. I mean, and I think you're right. I mean, it is just a sampler. It's a way of trying to engage, and this is what Transmission II is about: is trying to find those new ways to at least to engage people, to stimulate people to say, that's interesting, how can I find out more about that? This is the official launch of both Patrice's story, but also of the animation. It's called Confluence, and we're going to run the animation now. Yeah, please, all of you, enjoy.
Once, Shayap Lagoon was clean and loaded with fish. However, around 50 years ago, the temperature began to change. The glacier shrank, exposing rocks that had been hidden for thousands of years. These rocks contained dangerous metals such as arsenic and lead. Air and water oxidized them, turning them acidic, and everything ran into the lagoon. The fish died. The villagers' plantations died too. They looked for ways to clean the river. They created wetlands to filter it. Shayap is saved for now, but we must stop CO2 emissions to prevent glacial retreat and other effects elsewhere. In Colombia, the Bioresilience Project has been taking mud samples from the bottom of Andean lakes. This mud contains tiny fragments, clues about how the environment has changed over tens of thousands of years. Corn and butternut squash pollen tell us about the first farmers. A rise in charcoal fragments gives us clues about past fires. Colombia is one of the most biologically diverse countries on Earth. The ecologists at Bioresilience are working to map the complex webs of interactions between species in different environments. Our species, too, is part of the forests. Peasant and indigenous communities are deeply woven into this fabric. They must be heard, too, if we want to protect biodiversity. How can sustainable land use and conservation ensure all species, all habitats, and all communities thrive? In 1976, the UK suffered a very severe drought. In some areas of the country, the potato crop failed. Without its usual staple, the UK looked for alternatives. Pasta and rice were imported, and the nation moved on from potatoes and from its national dish, chips. The UK is expected to have drier and hotter summers in future. Scientists from DRY have been studying UK grasslands. They have demonstrated that areas with a large number of different plant species are more resilient to drought. How can we best cope with droughts in the future? And how else might climate change affect the UK? We need science to answer these important questions. And what about our chips? Imagine the world.
That was the animation Confluence, which sums up the three projects that Trans.MISSION II has been involved with in Peru, Colombia, and here in the UK. We're still obviously here with Patrice, Lindsey, Sarah, and Chris. Lindsey and Sarah, I think that's probably one of the first times you've seen the animation. How do you find the 1 minute of grassland coverage? Does it reflect well on the work you've been doing?
Finding different ways of packaging messages for different audiences, And you know, in the Dry project, we've done a lot of digital story work where it's 2 to 3 minutes of audio with the author's images. So this is a sort of extension where it's even more condensed, but it's impactful and memorable, which is part of the point of doing animation, I think.
Exactly. I think that is the way in which we, you know, it is that sort of, it's a taster. Pardon the pun with the chips reference, but Patrice, I think it makes a really nice, you know, a nod to the work which you were doing, as well as obviously reflecting the science.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just think it's quite funny that we all sort of pick up on the idea of the chips. And I think as sort of Lindsey was saying, it's just really interesting seeing out the different ways that you can sort of communicate science through art. So whether it's sort of a long form story, or, you know, film, or a very small animation. And I think actually, I suppose, you know, this is what the whole collaboration is about how we can share that knowledge in ways that different people can pick it up.
Also, I think it's about getting messages across in a more oblique way. Whereas it's not necessarily, the message is not necessarily in your face, but actually it's more emergent and oblique, and I think that's where the arts makes a real contribution.
I think you're right. I mean, I think we all learn in different ways, and there's no one way of communicating which is the best way. So, you know, stories and animations and newspaper articles and plays and films are all different ways, and we all connect and see them and read them in different ways, but it is a way of at least engaging people. I'm going to go to questions from the public now. They've been putting in their questions as we've been talking. So let's start off with, let's look at the, this is a question from Sam in Devon. In Devon, at least we are seeing more of very wet winters and dry summers, but most of us don't have the capacity to store much water beyond water butts. How can we, on a more local level, think about storing winter water better, whether personal or local, village or town, and then being able to use it in the summer? I guess that's one for Lindsey or Sarah.
Yeah, well, perhaps I can start. I mean, I find storage is quite a good way of engaging people, the concept, the idea of storage, because it's something that's scalable. You know, you can think about it in your house, you can think about it in your garden, you can think about it in your community setting. So, for example, sustainable urban drainage, although the language around that tends to be in relation to flood risk, actually it is about storing water and slowing the flow. And then scaling up, you know, there's a lot of interest in natural flood management this now and nature-based solutions. So how do you actually scale these as it's not just one action, it's a whole series of actions to try and make catchments, river catchments and their communities more resilient.
Sarah, what does does grassland management? I mean, we know about the trees. In terms of water catchment, can slow down the water, you know, rainwater from flooding down into villages. But can grassland management also have a similar impact on water catchment management?
Yes, it's enormously important, because when people have looked at the rate that water moves into soil, well-managed permanent pastures actually have almost the highest rate of infiltration of any type of vegetation. And the grass itself acts almost like a towel. You know, if you spill water on the floor and you chuck a towel down, it soaks it up. The grass has that effect in slowing the rate that water moves across the surface of the soil, which means that less soil is lost into the rivers and more water infiltrates, which means the water goes back into groundwater storage rather than being lost straight through the rivers. So it really helps to support, you know, the reservoirs of water within the soil and within the aquifers.
Okay, let's move on to the next question, and it is linked to this sort of storage issue. Do you think? I mean, I guess it's going to be a yes answer, but I shall put it to you. Should all new houses have to be built with large rainwater tanks and a system to use the water to flush toilets, water the garden, etc.? Flushing toilets with drinking water is absurd. Is the question from Helen. Anyone would like to disagree or agree with that?
I think creative thinking about grey water harvesting is important, and so just the costs of retrofitting houses with some of these technologies is quite high. So thinking about how you actually implement some of these things in new build. But some of this is around social norms, isn't it? About people's expectations about the quality of water. We do wash our cars with the same water and flush our toilets with the same water that we drink. And that's not the same across other countries. You know, there is quite a lot of variation in terms of practices internationally.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does seem to make sense to put it into building regulations that new builds, you know, just in terms of collection of water, grey water, rainwater harvesting, looking at the surfaces of around your new house, so it doesn't just it's not sort of increasing runoff. There's lots of new materials which can actually retain water much longer and stops the flooding, but also can help to store it.
Yeah.
Well,
another important thing. Sorry.
Sorry, go on. No, go on.
Another important thing is if people have rainwater running off their house, that it doesn't go into the sewage system, which a lot of people do put it directly into the sewage water or into storm drains. But if it goes into a soakaway, then that water actually stays in the soil and contributes to the groundwater. And I mean, that's why the water companies generally give you a reduction on your sewage rates if you do have your water going into a soakaway. But still, a lot of people have it just going straight into the sewers.
Yeah. Okay. So next question is from Joanna, and I mean it is how likely is water rationing in the UK, as imagined by Patrice in your story, Patrice? How likely is it in the next 10 years, or in 2040, 2060? When do we think? I mean, we've already had water rationing during droughts. I can remember water being rationed, hose pipe bans, etc., etc. But the sort of the level of water rationing which Patrice talks about, clearly it's an imagined future, but is it likely in the direction of travel we're going in at the moment, or is it something which we think, well, it is imagined and it's not going to be something that's so likely?
I guess that's a tricky question. It's probably a question for the water companies in terms of the way they manage water and so on. But in socioeconomic drought, severe drought, then there would be likely water rationing of some sort, and also about looking at the priorities in terms of water supply, who gets the water, and that is quite controversial as droughts play out as to the impact on the public communities, business, agriculture, and so on. So I'm not really answering the question, but I think it's one. The water supply companies do a lot of water scenario modelling in terms of possible water futures to try and ensure water supply and to mitigate against risk. But there are countries, when we were I'm thinking about Bristol Festival of Nature, when we were speaking to people from New Zealand and Singapore, their expectations of water coming out of the tap are very different from ours in the UK. They expect water at times when there isn't water coming out of the tap.
So well, let's see. But I mean, if we want to find out, I think it was Joanna. Let's get in touch with your water board. The couple of questions now for Patrice and Chris. Chris, how did you decide? Lucy asked this. How do you decide on what words and how did the words you use in the animation? Clearly, you've got to really pare them down to a minimal number. How did you write those words to maximize the message?
Yeah, well, for the UK, the Dry project, I had a Zoom chat with Sarah and Lindsey, and they explained to me their project, and they explained about, you know, the story in the 1970s, the drought that had inspired Patrice's story. So I thought that was a great thing to sort of explain. And then to reflect Patrice's story, I knew I wanted to finish with, you know, this British character who was missing his chips. So I basically made a rough draft. I made sure that it was sort of factually correct by sending it back and forth to NERC, Hannah at NERC, and to the scientists. And I also worked with my animator, Joe, who I usually do children's books, and Joe is really great with the sort of craft of animation. And he suggested some things to make it a bit more engaging. You know, that the character was his idea. So it was a collaboration, really. But all the time sending it back and forth and making sure that it was factually correct. And then Sarah and Lindsey sent me some of their slides so I could make sure the grasses were quite accurate towards the end. So that's how we kind of came up with it.
Okay, and Patrice, in terms of if there are other storytellers out there who feel the urge or would like to sort of to think about involving scientific facts within their stories, what sort of advice would you give them for working with scientists?
I mean, I think it was, for me, the main thing, because I'm not a scientist, so I couldn't sort of crunch the data and the ideas as quickly as obviously a scientist could. So I think the main thing for me is that it's what we're trying to say with the science, what are the messages, and I suppose what we want people to do. And then once I've got that, I think my favourite thing is actually thinking of a character and what the character wants, and then trying to sort of marry the two up. Because I think my worry was tempted to do something that has so much exposition in it, it doesn't feel like a story. So making sure that my character was very much a teenager, very much, your everyday teenager going on a date and thinking about what they would think, but also linking out sometimes to memories of the past, to things that they would have done with a grandparent or a parent. So you can see gradually what's changed. But I think keep it as simple as you can, really, because I suppose modern technology, you can link it to the blogs and link it to the other information. And also, I mean, for me, it was actually just making it relatable. And for me, chips are just so relatable.
Definitely, always chips. And just finally, Sarah and Lindsey, just very briefly, what advice would you give to other researchers looking to work with different storytelling methods? Maybe Lindsey, can you just quickly sort of answer that one?
Yeah, I mean, I've found I've worked with various creative practitioners and artists, and each one is different, and it's an exploratory process that involves sharing and dialogue. And I would just say go for it, because in each way I've learned, and I think that's what it's about. It's about finding different ways of understanding the science and communicating it effectively and getting people to rethink, their practices. It's about adaptation, but also transformation, as we saw in that story.
Thanks very much, Lindsey. Adaptation and transformation. That's a great phrase to be finishing with. I'd like to thank you all, Sarah, Lindsey, Patrice, and Chris, for joining us here today. Please, as an audience, please do go and watch the full story at Hay Festival website. It's the UK story, and Patrice has worked so hard on producing it, so please do go and watch the whole thing. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Thank you very much to the Natural Environment Research Council for partnering with us on this. And you can also watch the animation, Chris's animation, also on our website as well, or on our YouTube channel. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you for watching at home. Thank you and goodbye.